I'm going to be talking to Robert Asselin, a Senior Vice President of Policy for the Business Council of Canada, about his excellent Globe and Mail op-ed from last December titled, Canada Needs Its Own Bold Industrial Policy. The U.S. cannot keep carrying us. Now, before we begin the conversation, I have a conflict of interest to declare. Last year, the Alberta Federation of Labor contracted me to be the lead writer on a report, Skate to Where the Puck is Going, that leaned very heavily on industrial policy. And of course, I've had a keen interest in it ever since. So welcome to the interview, Robert.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the average Canadian probably isn't aware, but in policy circles, industrial strategy and policy is the hottest thing and is generating a lot of discussion, both inside the federal government, in some, but not all, provincial governments. And why is that? Let's start with what industrial policy is and why we're getting excited about it.
There are two main reasons for it, in my opinion. First is the new geopolitical configuration. And at the center stage of that, there's the US-China rivalry on national security, technological innovation, and that has very broad implications for countries that are trading nations such as ours. The second is, and it's linked to it, but it's a growing trend of protectionism that we see amongst Western economies, where because of the pandemic, because of new rivalries, people feel safer having some parts of their supply chain, closer to home than depending, let's say, to other countries that are less trusted. Let's say that. And so those are the two main drivers. I wouldn't go as far as a lot of people where it is being described by deglobalization. I would say it's a new form of globalization, maybe a more regionalized one, in North America being a good example. If you look at cars, EVs, energy, certainly it looks like it will be done more from a North American perspective. But you will see these economic blocks emerging. So that's the thrust of it, I think.
And viewers and listeners can go to the Energy Talks podcast and see a couple of months ago, I interviewed Shannon K. O'Neill about her argument that what we're headed for is not another form of globalization, but regionalization. So you can see you can hear the argument being explained in detail there. Now, back in 20, you mentioned this in your op-ed, but I ran across Joe Biden's campaign literature, and there was a paragraph in it, and this is from 2020, maybe it was from 2019, where he said, China is beating our pants off in industry, particularly clean energy, and he mentioned specifically electric vehicles. He said, I promise that by 2030, the U.S. will be back in the #1 position. And now we have the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS and Science Act, which you single out as the two biggest pieces of U.S. industrial policy.
It's really important to understand the size and the scope of these two bills you just mentioned. Older people remember the Apollo program, the space program in the 60s. These two bills are about at least double in constant dollars the amount of dollars that the U.S. government is investing. So it's industrial policy at scale, at very, very large magnitude. And it's very, very aggressive. People really need to understand this. And yes, Biden, to your point, telegraphed this before he ran as president. Actually, at the beginning of the primary season, when he was running as a Democratic candidate to get the nomination, at that point, I had written an op-ed in the Globe saying, guys, this is coming. We should prepare for it and have kind of our own thinking about industrial policy. And of course, it's a bit, it's nice for me to say that 3 years after, I was kind of right. Sean Spear and I had written New North Star, in which again we were seeing these trends and implying Canadian policymakers to be much more intentional about economic growth, economic policy in general, and this trend will not be possible to go around. And so here we are, a bit late in the game, trying to figure out what's our industrial policy.
Now, in your op-ed, you linked to a speech by U.S. Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo that I went and read. And if anyone wants to know exactly, in detail, spelled out clearly and articulately what the Americans are up to, read that speech. That was one of the most amazing speeches I've ever read for its clarity. Would you agree?
I totally agree. I wouldn't have said it better, to be honest. It explains where Americans are trying to win, and there are basically three families or three key elements to that strategy. First is computing, AI, quantum, everything that is linked to computing power. Second is biomanufacturing, and third is clean technology. And that's well explained and why it's important for national security, but also for growth. The other thing I should say and point out that I think is really important, it's not just a political economy consideration, in other words, just for national security. It's also because as countries evolve in the way they think about economic policy, and certainly the last 20 years we've seen this, we need, when you look at the current account deficit, trade balance, any economy that wants to be competitive need to produce goods and services. If you look at Canada and you take out oil and gas and car parts, we have a huge negative trade balance, and that's just not sustainable going forward. You need advanced manufacturing in countries if you want to be productive and if you want to be competitive.
Now, just last month, the International Energy released what I think is a seminal report. It's called Technology Perspectives 2023. It has kind of a bland name, but really what it said is that, first of all, we had the pivot from fossil fuels to clean energy, and we're thinking primarily wind and solar, but maybe nuclear and hydro as well. And this report said, now what we're pivoting to is clean energy industry. We have to build the wind turbines and the solar panels and the electric vehicles and the batteries. All of that, those parts, those products have to be manufactured, and we have to build the industry to do it. And the IEA, no less, argued that we are entering into the equivalent of a new industrial revolution. And I think, Robert, that the Americans get this. Mm-hmm. I don't think Canadians, I don't see that urgency, that magnitude of ambition, of the sense that the global economy is being transformed almost in real. I don't see that in Canada. Would you agree?
I agree. I've been saying that we've been very complacent. Part of it is cultural because historically we've been very gifted by natural resources. We've been gifted by our trading relationship with the US that is quite unique and special. These two things are still there, but are less secure for us than they were, let's say, in the last 30 years. So to your point, we need to develop a supply agenda, make things, produce things, and we need a science, technology, architecture renewal that would allow us to do this. You know, when you talk about clean tech, you really talk about bringing two technologies to the market. How do we take our public R&D and transform it into products and economic outputs in private firms and scale our firms as a result of it? And this is where, in my view, industrial strategy needs to be focused on, as opposed to giving subsidies to companies. It has to be focused on translating that R&D output into private firms, and that bridge in Canada is missing. In the US, over the last 50 years, they have developed very sophisticated mechanism in space, for example, with NASA, and in defense with DARPA, where people are bringing together industry and researchers to solve real-time problems and export those to private firms. In Canada, we've been very complacent about this, and we think innovation is still about funding R&D. It has to be much more than that.
Earlier this week, I interviewed Amanda Hall, is the CEO of Summit Nanotech. It's a startup out of Calgary that has developed nanotech the technology to strip lithium from briny water in what normally would take 18 months in a mine, can now be done in 1 day at less cost. And this is groundbreaking technology. And we talked about the valley of death, from this gap where from the bench, from concept and prototype to pilot project, demonstration project, and then getting into commercialization. And Amanda and her team had to go to Europe and the United States to get the funding,
right,
and the support expertise in order for her to do that. And she said, this is common. The other CEOs of startups I'm talking about, we're all having to do this because Canada just isn't structured. And in fact, one of her the companies that led it was BDC, a federal Crown corporation.
Mm-hmm.
This is how bad our system is broken.
It is. I would say it encourages creation of startups, and this is a good example you bring in. But the tough part is to take the startup and make it a global anchor firm. And in Canada, we've been very bad at this. I would say on the capital side, there are still huge challenges. One being that it takes patience for these companies to mature and to commercialize their invention, and then having clients on the other end. And by the way, the other thing we're not doing well is that public procurement often is not used to incentivize Canadian technology. If you look at NASA and DARPA, again, part of the reason why these big companies like Boeing and Lockheed Martin became what they are is that they were able to sell their stuff to the military. Of course, you could argue we don't have that kind of size and scale, but still, we could do much more at the provincial and federal level in terms of public procurement. The other thing is, I think our pension funds should be doing much more on the financing side, and should be incentivized maybe by the tax system to do so, because there's a huge pools of capital there that are being deployed elsewhere, unfortunately, and not in Canada. So I think there are ways to make this much better in terms of the ecosystem of finance.
Yeah, it's really ironic to see these large pension funds, including the CPP, investing in countries outside of Canada, taking basically Canadian capital and deploying it out where they have opportunity elsewhere. Now, last November, I was in Vancouver at a press conference by Jonathan Wilkinson, who's the Canadian Minister of Natural Resources, and he talked about industrial policy, and I asked him some very specific questions about it, and he made it very clear. He said, there are three components to Canadian industrial policy: carbon pricing, provision of capital, like these big subsidy funds that firms can apply to, and regulations. And, give the minister credit. He's been thinking about industrial policy. This is top of mind for him. He had a coherent answer. But what he outlined as Canadian industrial policy is woefully inadequate in the context that you and I are talking.
Absolutely agree with your assessment there. Unless, first of all, you need to be much more specific in terms of sectoral composition. And going back to Raimondo's speech, identifying where you want to win is really important. In Canada, it's still too broad. We're not a big country, so we have to be clear about where we have a competitive advantage. Second is, it's easy for the state to be all over the place and say, we're going to try to do everything and boil the ocean. I think where industrial strategy works, where it de-risks private investments. And where private investments are lacking is that the industrial research, what used to be the corporate labs in the 50s and 60s, that were amazing engines of growth, but that were left aside by corporations because they were too risky and too expensive. That model has to be recreated. And this is why I'm so fond of the DARPA model, because I think it's basically a modern version of corporate labs where industry and academia comes together with private sector funding, not just public funding, and are able to commercialize and absorb these technologies into the economy. And this is where I find Canada positioning is really weak. We still give the money to granting councils, hoping that somehow some things will change, and they never are. We let researchers do the research that they want, not thinking about what is important and not thinking it to industrial policy. And I'm not saying it's one or the other, but it should be better balanced. And we give a lot of the subsidies to companies that are not at the sector level, but at the firm's level. And I would argue that's the wrong way to do industrial policy.
Well, let me give you an example of drawn from Alberta. Now, under Premier Peter Lougheed in the 70s and 80s, they had Astra, which
Absolutely.
basically developed the modern steam-assisted gravity drainage, without which the oil sands would not have expanded to where it is today. And it was extremely successful. And then, of course, it got folded into something else and kind of withered away. But today, the Alberta Innovates, which is the provincial innovation agency, has been working since 2018 on turning bitumen into carbon fiber precursor. And they think that in a couple, 2 to 3 years, they'll have a commercial ready process, and then they will be able to produce carbon fiber at scale at about half the current cost. So this is an area where the provincial agency has sponsored the R&D, sponsored the science,
Yes.
come up with a commercial process. And there's, the UCP government, when it came in 2019, cut the budget of the Alberta Innovates budget. Instead of expanding it, they cut it by about, I think, about 25, 30%. And there's no real strategy tied to it to when that process is ready to commercialize, to then commercialize it.
Right.
And to attract the private investment. And I've talked to, for an article I wrote, I talked to the vice president of a Missouri-based carbon fiber company who's been following this, and they said, when that's ready, we will build a plant in Alberta to make carbon fiber, because you make it, you site the plant close to where the carbon fiber precursor is made. And this gets mentioned every once in a while by the government or by the opposition that they think it's a great idea, but there's no industrial strategy and policy tied to what is an enormous opportunity. And this is just one example that's coming out of this innovation network.
I'm so glad you brought forward the Astra example, because I think it's very powerful. Like, we've done this before in Canada, it has worked. And it has provided Canadians amazing living standards as a result of it. You know, this is not abstract. When we talk about industrial strategy, people think there's a bunch of academics thinking about models of economic growth. It's not what this is about. This is about raising GDP per capita. This is about raising living standards, you know, lifting all boats with rising tides. And I think this has to be understood. The problem is, I think sometimes governments overreach, and that's why industrial policy has such a bad connotation for a lot of people on the right. And on the left, I think people are trying to solve too many problems that the state is not able to solve. And so I'm kind of a more pragmatic, I come to it from a more pragmatic standpoint, and I look at it as an ecosystem, and I see where does the ecosystem need reinforcement. And for me, industrial R&D, you know, the stage from invention to economic output is lacking, and this is where it needs reinforcement. But it requires sophistication, it requires policy instruments, it requires policy design, and it also requires, this is the problem with all these crown corporations that we have, some questioning as to what works and what doesn't. You know, these programs that give billions every given year, and we don't know if it works or not, and people still keep going. And we have tons of them. We have dozens of these agencies out there giving money to a lot of people. So it's more a question of focusing and being more intentional as what is it we're trying to solve here.
Yeah, I'd have to agree, and we should point out that Canada actually does have that innovation ecosystem is not entirely absent.
Right.
There's the Canadian Research Innovation Network, CRIN as it's known. There are provincial innovation agencies. I just mentioned the Alberta one, but other provinces have them as well.
Right.
It seems like there's opportunity being lost, but sort of left behind because we're not doing it in the very deliberate, strategic fashion that the Americans are. And so we kind of do it willy-nilly. And if something succeeds, well, we pat ourselves on the back. And if it doesn't, well, who's paying attention anyway? And it's that leadership on the policy side. And you mentioned Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland's calls for, a real muscular industrial strategy in Canada. But the federal government has not followed that up. This is like last October, she said this. They haven't followed it up with a strategy or with a process to get a strategy. And again, we're in this kind of Canadian, limbo where we muddle through again.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Every budget, it seems they have something out in the window, a growth fund, an innovation agency, and 1 year later, we still don't know what these things are, how they're going to work, who they're going to target, which problems are they are trying to solve. And so, and how do they interact with all the existing ones? That's my concern. You have SDTC, you have BDC, you have EDC, you have all this constellation of agencies that probably, as you say, are doing some good things. But what's important, it's in the aggregate. Are we focused enough to make a substantial difference in some key sectors of advanced industries? And the other thing I'm quite critical about how the government's approach it works is that it's very untargeted. You have to pick sectors. Again, my point about sectoral composition is that there are sectors where R&D is more concentrated, where productivity gains will be higher, where innovation is absolutely essential. And that's basically all around advanced manufacturing. You have to produce goods in agriculture, in the energy sector, in all the stuff that historically we've been good at. But you have to bring R&D at scale and technology to make these sectors even more productive. And that's how we're going to grow the pie.
Just to wrap up our conversation, Robert, the one thing we haven't talked about so far is urgency. Right. And this is why I brought up the IEA report, the Technology Perspectives 2023. That and other interviews that I've done with S&P Global and Bloomberg NEF and so on, those experts take a global view of this. And I asked them, how long do we have? Does Canada have till 2030? Does it have a decade, 2 decades? And their response almost universally is Canada has 2 to 5 years to get its act together, because other countries are chasing the clean energy technology opportunities that we would like to. Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, these are all countries that have very aggressive policies, and they want this as much as we do. And if we don't move now, the window of opportunity closes, and then it's not getting into those supply chains once they've hardened and formed is very, very difficult. Would you agree?
I totally agree. And just to give a concrete example of this, when the Ukraine war started, it was obvious that it would eventually trigger an energy crisis for European countries and Asian countries. Since then, 2 heads of government from Japan and Germany have come to Canada begging for LNG, and we let them go home, essentially saying, we might send you some hydrogen in 5-10 years from now. That's a window of opportunity that we missed. And to me, it's very indicative of how we think as a country. Why did the Americans become so good on the space sector, It's because they were threatened by Russians with the Sputnik crisis in the 50s. Same with defense. There was a military national security urgency to build defense capabilities with wars. Why is Germany so good at advanced manufacturing? Because it fought two world wars. Again and again, why South Korea is so innovative? Well, look at where they are located. And so now I think Canadians have to take into account that we live in this threatening world where our neighbor just put this bazooka out with this IRA and CHIPS Act saying, guys, wake up. And if you don't, we'll take all your markets. Capital is very mobile. And so, yes, we have talent. Yes, we have renewable energy. Yes, we have a lot of good things that most countries want. But if you don't have that sense of urgencies of ambition and execution is so important in this country and so lacking. All these fights between the feds and the prov, if we don't get our act together, these opportunities will like the LNG pass and we'll miss the window. We won't become a poor country, but we'll become a poorer country, that's for sure.
Well, Robert, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I hope there are a few politicians and policymakers that have listened to it. So, well, thank you very much.
I appreciate the invitation.